there's always a lot of rumors going around at the combine. Have you heard any connected to the 49ers? And I bring this up because Mike Silver wrote an article saying, the Niners may make some dramatic moves, and they're not just going to try to run it back. You may even see some veteran sacred cows kind of gone. I immediately started thinking of Eric Armstead. Other people brought up names like Debo and Kittle, but what do you think? I mean, the Niners have done free agency in a big way the last couple of years. They've let guys walk, and then 2 years ago they got Mooney. Last year they got Hargrave. What do you think? Is there any chance that they try to steal? I know L'Jarius Sneed is they're saying may get traded for a second-round pick. Could the Niners be that team that gives a second-round pick to Kansas City for Sneed in a similar deal to the one they made for D Ford, which obviously did not work out for the Niners that well, but worked out well for Kansas City? And then, of course, Chris Jones is rumored to be back at Kansas City, and there's a lot of optimism there. But, man, I mean, if you want to shake things up, make a move off of one of your tackles and find a way to get Chris Jones to come to San Francisco, that would be amazing. Are you hearing any rumors at all tied to free agency in the 49ers there?
Yeah, well, a couple of things that I reported this week. A lot of the buzz is that if the Niners go internal, and I know this isn't free agency, but I'll get to that in a moment. I've heard that if the Niners go internal, Nick Sorensen is most likely the candidate to be defensive coordinator to take over for Steve Wilks. I had a source reach out to me and say that Brandon Ayuk isn't going anywhere. And this is actually some interesting information here. John Lynch is best friends with Brandon Ayuk's agent, and Brandon Ayuk's agent was at John Lynch's Hall of Fame ceremony, and John Lynch was the best man in his wedding. And John Lynch even said on Tuesday when he met with the media, look at our track record of how we take care of our homegrown players. And he's totally right. In consecutive years, George Kittle contract extension, Fred Warner contract extension, Debo Samuel contract extension, Nick Bosa contract extension. I think Brandon Ayuk is going to be the fifth contract extension in a row of a player who the Niners drafted, developed, and then paid to a long-term deal. So I'm hearing that Ayuk isn't going anywhere, and San Francisco has no plans on trading him. So those are the two things that I've heard on my end as far as buzz. As far as free agency and going into the offseason, I'll tell you what, if San Francisco has an opportunity to get L'Jarius Sneed for a second-round pick, I'd do it in a heartbeat. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. Just like the Kool-Aid McKinstry formal meeting is interesting. You could have, let's say, L'Jarius Sneed, Charvarius Ward as your outside perimeter corners. The fact that Logan Ryan was getting snaps in the Super Bowl is a joke because San Francisco was getting torched there by Kansas City. You don't have to worry about that because Diamador Lenore stays in the slot with, let's say, Sneed and Ward on the outside, or Kool-Aid McKinstry and Ward on the outside. But Mooney Ward, if we're going to talk about financial issues with San Francisco, he's going into the final year of his deal. And this has been a great bargain deal for the Niners. They've paid him on an average annual value basis of about $14 million per year. This is the final year of his contract. They envision him being their corner one, and he's been a corner one. He was the second team All-Pro this past year. He led the NFL in pass breakups, and he was tied for fourth in interceptions. But if they have to make some difficult financial decisions, do they trade for a player like Sneed? Do they draft a young corner, pair them up for 2024, and then let Mooney Ward walk after that? Because then they're going to have to pay Amador Lenore, and maybe you utilize him as your other outside corner, which with whatever one that you either signed in free agency, traded for, or drafted. So I think that's pretty interesting. And with Kansas City, you're paying Mahomes all this money. You're going to give Andy Reid a contract extension. I know that doesn't impact the salary cap, but Trent McDuffie is a really good blossoming young player. If they sign Chris Jones, are they going to have money to re-sign a L'Jarius Sneed? And I think that they're this offseason going to address that wide receiver spot for Patrick Mahomes and give him some more weapons, whether that be through the draft or free agency. So money could get a little bit tight for Kansas City. That's where Sneed becomes really interesting. I know Niner fans are saying, bring in Chris Jones, bring in Chris Jones. That's just not financially possible. But going back to that Mike Silver piece that you started the question off with, he talked about major moves being made as far as the draft, as far as free agency, but maybe moving on from some veteran players. Eric Armstead was the first name that comes to mind because I think that he could be a cap casualty post June 1. The cap savings for the Niners would be $18 million. The dead money, though, would be $10 million. So really, you're saving $8 million there. Pre-June 1 is just not going to happen because the dead money is $25 million and the cap savings is only $2.5 million. So that then brings me to some of the other options. Is it a Kyle Juszczyk? I think a contract restructure is a lot more realistic. Is it Deebo Samuel? Post June 1 for him, dead cap charge of $11 million. Cap savings is $17 million. I don't think it happens, but that's a possibility. I threw this out on my show because I like doing thought-provoking content, not boring shows. Christian McCaffrey. Mike Silver was talking about how the Niners are looking at players who are still really good, but maybe starting to decline a little bit. If you want to save some money, could McCaffrey be an option? Again, I don't think this is going to happen, but it's certainly worthy of having that conversation. He has 2 more years on his deal. He makes a lot of money at running back. If you look at the NFL leaders and carries and touches, that following season, their production is always about cut in half by about 50%. McCaffrey has a little bit of an injury history. He's getting a little bit older, and this year led the NFL in touches, led the NFL in rushing yards. And what's the realistic future of him? How long is he going to be an impact player at this rate? Post June 1, there's only a dead cap charge of $2.1 million. You would save $12 million with a player like that. And then lastly, I think Dre Greenlaw is an option. I know it would be doing the Niners enforcer dirty, a player who's the heart and soul of this defense, a player who the Niners really missed in Super Bowl 58, but he tore his Achilles, and sometimes players aren't the same, and he has a little bit of an injury history too. If you cut him after June 1, dead cap charge of less than $1 million. And then the cap savings is at $8.5 million. So these are just ideas. I guarantee you these are things that the Niners organization are talking about. I'm not reporting that, but that's how this business goes. And I'm fascinated to see how they manipulate the cap and what roster choices they do make with some of the star players on this team. Because at some point, with Brock Purdy's contract extension looming, Brandon Ayuk's as well, you're going to have to make some of these difficult roster moves.
There's so many factors here. And we're now, Chase, starting to go, this entire regime has been about build up. Now some of these players are getting a little long in the tooth. Now we're 1 year away from Brock Purdy getting paid. Now there's some urgency. Some of these guys' windows may be closing. If there's going to be a trade, trading some of these guys this year as opposed to next year, the difference in what you'll get back is dramatic. If I said to you, be a gambling man, give me the one veteran player of note that you think either gets cut or traded that the fans would go, what? Who would that be in your mind?
I think Dre Greenlaw fits that bill because a lot of people would say, wow, he tore his Achilles in the Super Bowl. He played at an all-pro caliber level, and now you're going to move on for him. That's really doing a team leader dirty. But at the same time, I just broke down the cap numbers. That's a move that makes a lot of sense. Your dead cap charge is less than $1 million, and you say 8. So that's a move that would make a lot of sense. I don't think a George Kittle trade would be insane. The Niners have met with tight ends here at the NFL Combine. They're at least looking at that position. At the very least, I think they have to bring in a competent pass-catching weapon at tight end, because it just makes this offense more multiple. It makes this offense a little bit more dangerous, but that's another name. And then maybe Kyle Juszczyk. At the very least, you have to restructure some of these contracts as well. Eric Armstead's another player that I think could fit that too. If you can find a trade partner for a guy who's good against the run, who can break down the interior of the pocket, who you'd probably love to move on from that contract and all that money, that's another player that you have to throw into the mix too. There are a lot of different options for San Francisco. None of these things would surprise me, but I think it could surprise some of the fans out there.
One tight end, and I don't even know if he got invited to the Combine. Did the Furman kid get invited to the Combine, Mason Pline?
I'm not sure. I don't remember seeing him.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't see him on the list here, but he's a basketball player. The guy's got 10-inch hands. He's like, if you watch him on the basketball floor, he looks like Aaron Gordon. I mean, he can run the floor and jam, but he's also a mechanical engineering major. He played basketball at Ferris State, transferred to Furman. He's got 10.5-inch hands. I love that kid playing as a day 3 sleeper at tight end for the 49ers. One other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, yesterday on his social media, Azeez Al-Shaair posted an interception that he had with the 49ers against Kirk Cousins. He signed a 1-year deal in Tennessee for $5 million. What do you think of maybe, and the other thing on the Greenlaw front, I had read that maybe they could cut him, re-sign him to like an injury designation and pay him like $2.5 million. Maybe he would agree to do that. I don't know. I mean, obviously he was drafted by the 49ers in the 5th round. He's been a Niner his whole career. I know he's a team leader. It's going to look bad if they cut him loose just because he's hurt right now when he's given up everything, played hurt for them so many times. But what do you think of Azeez Al-Shaair maybe getting $8 to $10 million in a contract from the 49ers and returning after 1 year in Tennessee?
I think he's a spectacular player. And when he was with the Niners, when he was with Tennessee, very instinctual player, really good feel. He fits the Niners mold of what they look for in linebackers. That's why they drafted him as a player who's very versatile and has really good sideline-to-sideline speed. He can cover. He can fill the gaps in the run game. You can also include him in some of these blitz packages. I'm interested to see how San Francisco looks at him as far as a salary, because they're already paying Fred Warner a lot of buzz that maybe he could land a contract extension to lower the cap hit for 2024. That would make a lot of sense. He's still in his mid-20s and playing at an elite level. You gave Dre Greenlaw that deal that gave him about $8 million per, but you're without him. The Niners, with this defense that has a lot of Seattle components to it, and that Seattle defense relied upon their linebackers a lot, rely on linebacker play. So you have Fred Warner here. You draft the D winners and Jalen Graham last year. I thought they flashed in the preseason, and they kind of remind me a little bit of an Al-Shaair. Sideline to sideline speed, very quick, maybe not all that bulky like a Bobby Wagner or a Dre Greenlaw, but are they ready to play for this defense, which is going to have Super Bowl expectations regardless of who the defensive coordinator is? You can get by with them maybe, but for sure you know what you have in Azeez Al-Shaair. You have familiarity with him. He was in the building. In the lead up to that Packers game, he was on the field celebrating with the linebacker room, and in his first full season as a starter for Tennessee last year, he was 5th in tackles for loss, couple of sacks, good against the run, good in coverage, so active, very aggressive. He's still a really young player, and he'd be a tremendous fit on this Niners defense as well, again, regardless of who the defensive coordinator is. And if you don't think that Dre Greenlaw is going to be with you for much of the year, I know there was that report from Dr. Kenneth Jong that maybe he can return for the start of the regular season. I think that's a difficult task considering it was a torn Achilles that he suffered in February. You go the Azeez Al-Shaair route, you're going to have to pay him. And that's what it comes down to because of how well he played with Tennessee. And Rand Carthon really recognized how good of a player he was. And that's why he brought him with him to Nashville. And it ended up being a really good bargain deal for Tennessee. But because he played so well with the Titans this past year, his price tag has gone up. I'd like it. I'm just not sure if San Francisco is going to be willing to pay that much money.
What do you make of the fact you've already kind of hit on the Ayuk thing? Juwan Jennings, if the Niners had won the Super Bowl, could have been the MVP of the Super Bowl. Yeah. Supposedly they're working on an extension for him. They're working on an extension for Ayuk. They've got Debo already extended. They've got some depth at wide receiver, and yet they're meeting with a number of wide receivers. What do you make of that? Is Jennings going to get traded? Is Debo going to get traded? Are the Niners? What's your read? I mean, there's not enough room at the end for all these wide receivers.
No, and keep in mind that free agency starts not this week, but next week. And I think San Francisco is getting ahead of this early and meeting with all these wide receivers, and they're meeting with a lot of different players. slot wide receivers, perimeter wide receivers, burners, possession type of wide receivers, red zone targets, guys who are a little bit bigger and bulkier, who can climb the ladder and bring the football down. I think what this tells me, it's not that Debo's going to get dealt or cut. The dead cap charge is just too much for him to get cut. They want Brandon Ayuk to be a part of their plans, and Ayuk in contract negotiations is letting it be known, according to Niners Sports Talk on Twitter, that he wants number one targets moving forward, and I totally see why. No DB's been able to lock him down, and San Francisco understands how valuable he is and how good of a player he is, and they've overseen his development and invested a lot in him, and because of that, I think they're going to invest in him further. I think why the Niners are meeting with wide receivers here, they might be a little bit worried that a team is just going to give Jauan Jennings so much money that they simply can't afford him. And instead of going with a reunion type like Kendrick Bourne, they're going to go after a cost-controlled, money-efficient young player who can be a part of this team for the next 4 or 5 years and maybe be even better than Jauan Jennings. And that's not a slight on Jauan Jennings. Third and Jauan is a thing. He consistently came up huge on the money downs. He's an incredibly clutch player. He's the epitome of what the Niners look for in a player, a dog, a guy who's tough, a willing blocker, a guy who will chop it up with the opponent, talk a little shit. I love Jauan Jennings, but if another team gives him $8 million, $5 million, because they could see him being a high-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 2, and then from Jauan Jennings' standpoint, his career with the Niners, it's been awesome, right? But does he want to go somewhere where he could be targeted more in an offense to show what he can do? Because I think with more targets, his production could be really solid. I think this is a sign here that the Niners are worried another team across the NFL is going to give Jauan Jennings a bag. Niners aren't going to be able to keep him. The RFA tender is expensive. It's almost at like $3 million. And is that why the Niners are looking at all these wideouts? It's unfortunate that they're going to get nothing from Danny Gray, who was the third-round pick out of SMU. I think he's on his way to being a bust. But the good news here for the Niners, day 2, day 3, a lot of really talented wideouts who I think could be game changers inside Kyle Shanahan's system. And a lot of the wide receivers, one, really like Brandon Ayuk, and they've been complimentary of Kyle Shanahan's system.
Yeah. Brendan Rice in some ways could be an upgrade on Jauan Jennings. He's faster. He's big. He's very serious about the game of football, and you can see it in his route running. We mentioned Armstead before. Cal State here asked this question. He says, Tavondre Sweat, 362 pounds, number 32 ESPN top prospect. We got this one as well from Whale and Wasp. He says, Larry, what is your thought on Fisk? Well, I love Fisk. His motor's incredible. His film is great. His workout was amazing. The way he went over the bags on the gauntlet was just like, you look like a linebacker. Sweat has got a lot of bad weight. I mean, you can see he's got boobs and but he's also a monster. Who do you think if obviously Hargrave's here and Hargrave's great against the pass, but he's not great against the run. If they are going to replace Armstead, what kind of defensive tackle do you think they're looking for? Do you think they're looking for a 2-gapper like Tavondre Sweat? Or do you think, because they have the wide 9, everybody's a pass rusher, you get up the field, you rush the passer, that a guy like Sweat may not fit their scheme? What's the best compliment in your mind? Because, we saw him in Philly, Hargrave next to Fletcher Cox. Well, Tavondre Sweat is more along the lines of a Fletcher Cox. He's a condominium. He's a huge man. What's the ideal type defensive tackle you think next to Hargrave?
Yeah, I'd actually say Sweat kind of compares to Jordan Davis a little bit, who's gotten off to a slow start since being a first-round pick by Philadelphia. And the Eagles actually moved up to take him, I think, 14th overall in the draft 2 years ago. And what worries me about him, he's an athletic freak, right? 6'6", 340. He ran, I think, a sub-5 40-yard dash in the combine a couple of years ago out of Georgia. He was top 10 in Heisman Trophy voting, but he struggled to stay in shape. And he's not a 3-down player. And I know that we're not talking about this defensive tackle being a 3-down player, but ideally you want a player who can be a 3-down guy. So I don't think it's Sweat. I think he's a little bit too heavy. I don't think he's a scheme fit. I think Fisk turned a lot of heads yesterday with his athletic testing numbers. He's an absolute freak, and I think he is a 3-down player who could play really well against the run. And then McKinley Jackson, I think, is just in better shape as compared to Sweat. So I think he's a better option too.
Yeah, McKinley Jackson, by the way, I'm an A&M fan. Two-time, this was the player of the year. This was Mr. Football in the state of Mississippi. He was as highly recruited as anybody. He's been the Aggies captain the last 2 years, and he's just really well thought of in College Station for sure. I mean, in A&M, obviously, look what Matabuke's done. I mean, this guy's different than Matabuke, but he's strong as a house and definitely a leader.